Thank you very much. Thank you, Bernard. And just to say that it is a privilege to be here and to have this opportunity to talk about David, and I approach it with some trepidation. Those who know me know that I deliver many lectures, many presentations, one form or another. I wouldn't say that I can do them in my sleep. Sometimes it may seem like that. But this talk is somehow different because I want to feel that I'm sufficiently honouring this great man, David Fontana. So I want to apologise in advance if I don't achieve that. So we had technical difficulties. You know what? I think he's here. Anyone who knew David, he came kicking and screaming into the PowerPoint generation. And so maybe there's more going on than we know. I'm talking about David Fontana as transpersonal psychologist, but I think it's important that I start with David Fontana as a rare human being. And the fact is that I think transpersonal psychology is a discipline maybe somewhat unique. You can't be somewhat unique. It must be unique or not unique. In that the quality of a person as indeed a human being is effectively part of what they are as a transpersonal psychologist. I don't think, it's a point of discussion maybe, but I don't think you can really bring forward the vision of transpersonal psychology with its relationship to mysticism and spiritual growth and so on. You can't really be part of that without being a proper human being. And David was so fully qualified in that way. I wanted to refer to some words that I wrote. We mentioned there's several obituaries. At the funeral, David's son-in-law, I think also called David, read out something that I had written to the family. And I just want to quote from it because it sums up really what I felt. Beyond all David's scholarly achievements, it was his truly human qualities that mattered most. I can only put it this way. I genuinely felt good in his presence. For all we shared ideas and plans, it was the warmth he brought into our meetings that was so special. He had a distinctive way of enabling those around him to feel valued. And I think that is an incredible gift. I shall miss him greatly, as I'm sure will many, many others. David Fontana as transpersonal psychologist, well, we've already heard about his important role in the development of transpersonal psychology in this country and beyond. And I would say that one of the most important things in honouring his legacy, which is the title for our day today, is that we move these things forward. For all I talk about David as transpersonal psychologist, I think the most important thing is that we move this vision, these ideas, obviously in relation to the psychical material as well, moving forward. And as Bernard announced, I'm now chair of the section, the British Psychological Society, and that is my real task, is to move that forward, and whatever, more so than what I say today, moving the presence of transpersonal psychology forward in this country and hopefully beyond. That's how I honour the work that David has done. We say he's a great human being, there's no question. When I was preparing for this talk, I heard so many of his words. It's like I was reliving the presentations he gave, and that wonderful, mellifluous, poetic, already mentioned by Ingrid, style. He was a great orator, and he had a breadth of knowledge to make that oratory really substantive. As transpersonal psychologist, of course, he was very influential. He was influential on me in many ways, more than I can really go into here. But just to say that there was a conference he organised back in 1986 in Cardiff on Eastern approaches to self and mind. In 1986, I was a lecturer in psychology, maybe somewhat junior, and this conference was an eye-opener to me, because at that time I was, as Bernard will know, I had already been very interested in spiritual and mystical areas for a long time, and I felt this struggle to try and interrelate my interest in mysticism with my more academic profile in psychology, academic psychology. And that conference was really crucial in opening the door to show the ways in which we could embrace, with our serious psychology hats on, we could embrace the spiritual and the mystical. It was influenced me in another way. I'll mention, this is somewhat personal way, but I will mention it. We were together in, I think it was 1991, a conference in Greece. And at that time I just published my first book, which was in psychology. And I had been approached to write a book on Judaism, my own religion. And I was very hesitant because I felt that maybe this was not going to be a wise career move. It doesn't sit well in the CV for academic psychology. And I discussed this with David at that time, and he was strongly encouraging me. And I respect and welcome that input. It's been said that he was crucial in establishing our section of transpersonal psychology. When I talk with people in other countries, they are envious, especially in America. They are very envious of the fact that we have transpersonal psychology recognized within the mainstream professional body of psychology in this country, the British Psychological Society. How did it come about? There is no question. If anyone knows how these circles move, we had the right man in the right place at the right time, and that was David. And again, we are all very grateful for his role there. I want to then examine in more detail why I regard David as an important and influential transpersonal psychologist. And I'm going to quote quite an extensive quote, and I make no apologies because these are David's words, from his most recent book, published posthumously, Is Christianity Good for You? I freely admit that my life experiences, both in the inner and the outer worlds, have brought me to a religious interpretation of reality. In addition to my interest in Christianity, I spent more than 30 years exploring Eastern religions, studying under holy men and women, attending intensive retreats, visiting religious centers at home and abroad. I have questioned and listened, weighed the evidence against what I know of the human mind and of human behavior, identified things with which I agree and things with which I disagree. Within both Christianity and Eastern religions, I have compared the religious approach to explaining and dealing with psychological suffering with that of Western counseling and psychotherapy, and noted the existence of many similarities. I have studied the symbolism and the rituals that are a major part of many forms of religious worship, and studied and practiced and written about meditation, contemplation, visualization, and other spiritual practices. With colleagues, I have been instrumental in establishing transpersonal psychology, and I have attempted to work on my own spiritual development, and to argue against the materialistic philosophy that currently dominates science and much of modern living. Throughout this time I have used my training as a scientist to appraise what I have learnt and experienced. I think those are great words. Not only that, as we know, they're well written. If I evaluate David as transpersonal psychologist, it's really all in that extract. He has questioned and listened. He has weighed the evidence. He has worked on his own spiritual development, etc. All the things that came in. These are the characteristics of transpersonal psychology. His interest in religion, it seems to me very poignant that this last book is specifically on Christianity. Those who knew him well know that was really an important part of his life, especially his later life. And actually that's another thing that I would want to explore in relation to the title, David Fontana as Transpersonal Psychologist. I think there's a slightly uneasy relationship between religion and transpersonal psychology. Often we try and find our way around those difficulties. So we use the word spirituality or mysticism or comparative religion. Well, the truth is, David was very committed to a particular religion. As I say, towards the end of his life especially. And again, I'm pleased to be able to stand here and talk about this because I felt I shared a great deal of that with him. Does that disqualify him as a transpersonal psychologist? Of course not. But it's the other side, the ones I quoted, using his scientific training, exploring diverse religious practices, etc. That's what makes for transpersonal psychology. David Fontana as transpersonal psychologist. I think you would search in vain for the Fontana school of transpersonal psychology. If I was standing here talking about some other characters in the field, I could say, oh yes, well they had this particular approach. Ken Wilber, that approach. Jorge Ferrer, a particular approach. For those who know, Michael Washburn, and so on. I don't think we will find that. I don't think that David Fontana had a particular innovative line. But that was outweighed by his, firstly, the qualities of a human being, which I've already talked about, but by his amazing capacity to grasp the historical and human significance of transpersonal psychology. I want to make another quote, this time from his work called Psychology, Religion and Spirituality. After all, if we're going to talk about someone as a transpersonal psychologist, maybe we need to have a definition of transpersonal psychology. So what I'm going to quote you is his definition. And I draw your attention particularly to the second word. The second word is brief. A brief definition of transpersonal psychology is that it studies and seeks to understand the nature, varieties and causes of those human experiences in which the sense of identity appears to go beyond, i.e. trans, that of individuality, and encompasses other people, the natural world, even the cosmos. Together with the behaviors, philosophies, disciplines, arts, cultures, lifestyles, and religions inspired by these experiences. It is also concerned with the practices such as meditation, ritual and prayer that assist in the development of transpersonal states, with the body-mind-soul relationship, and with the insights, intuitions, altered states of consciousness and creative inspiration that illuminate these states. Not so brief. but inclusive. That's what David brought to the field. And it's not just, I could analyse in detail that definition. I could perhaps criticise that it's not really that brief and concise, but it encompasses everything that I would want to encompass in what transpersonal psychology is. And again, that's David. It's not just a question of these words that he wrote. He was inclusive in many ways. Again, back to his qualities as a human being, that's what came across. The meeting, for those of us who have been at the conference of the Transpersonal Psychology section, this incredible sense of inclusiveness, which in no small measure emanated from David. You felt part of something when you were in David's presence. That's a wonderful, wonderful quality. And of course, in his writing also, as I'm indicating, he was inclusive. And I remember, like I said before, that these phrases that he would use kind of drifted in and out as I was sort of preparing this. I remember him saying on many occasions, the whole of Western culture is based on transpersonal values. And this wasn't just a vacuous statement. It was backed up with his incredible sweep, his understanding of historical processes. In the theistic traditions, certainly Christianity, Judaism, we say that God is revealed through history. It takes a certain grasp of the historical process to kind of really relate to what is being said there. I think David had that grasp. So, to summarise, but I've got more to say, don't get too excited. David Fontana was a transpersonal psychologist. Firstly, because of the human qualities. He was a fine man and a fine transpersonal psychologist. His sense of scale, his understanding of history, his sweep of knowledge. The emphasis he placed on experiential work, already mentioned by Bernard. He was really engaged with the traditions. His eagerness to subject the insights he drew from these traditions to scientific scrutiny. And then also, which I haven't explored so much so far, the epistemology, ways of knowing. And actually this is a topic that is close to my heart. In many of my writings, I've explored transpersonal psychology as a discipline within the broad church of psychology, as a discipline how it relates to the scientific traditions which psychology has tried to embrace. These, I think, are very, very important questions, and not for us to go into great detail here, but they're important because obviously the knowledge you have is only as good as the quality of the methods whereby you gain that knowledge. So it is a crucial topic. And David was very aware of that importance. It divides into two areas really. One is the methodologies that we use. How do we relate to experiential knowing, for example? How do we establish that as a core of a discipline? And the other is concerned with the levels of explanation. What are the categories whereby we try to coherently explore the material that is the subject matter of our discipline? And here another of those phrases that floated in and out as I was preparing to speak today. We are not biological machines. I heard you say that many times. We need to understand the difference across differing levels of explanation. The reductive enterprise of physicalism has its place, but it denigrates what it is to be a full human being. That's an important thing that David not only stood for, but articulated through his very being. Of course, his interest in survival, which I'm sure we'll hear more about today, that very much relates to that point. We are not biological machines. Another quote. Time for another quote. This time from a chapter he wrote within the book edited by Max Wellmans to do with phenomenal consciousness, investigating phenomenal consciousness. David's chapter is called The Nature and Transformation of Consciousness in Eastern and Western Psychospiritual Traditions. So I quote him. Good psychology takes into consideration the accounts that people give of themselves. Indeed, it regards these accounts as part of the essential raw material of the subject. Once heeded, these accounts can and should be subjected to careful scientific scrutiny. But in and of themselves, particularly if they manifest uniformity and consistency, they serve as an essential starting point for psychological investigation. This is perhaps especially so of accounts of inner experience, and in the present context of accounts of inner experience that show common features across the long-established Eastern and Western traditions under discussion. Again, it's a great piece of writing. It's like a manifesto. That he follows that particular paragraph with 12 cases, 12 examples where he finds the kind of commonalities that he's referred to across these diverse traditions. I'm not going to read through all those. But what I am going to comment on is the sophistication of the analysis and the clarity with which he systematized that material. Again, I place these as crucial qualities in evaluating David as transpersonal psychologist. He understood the traditions, he'd worked with the traditions, he'd brought his scientific training to bear on them, he had, as I said, a very broad-scale understanding of history which enabled him to work with these diverse traditions in various ways, and this last point, that he was a communicator par excellence. He systematized the material and presented it to us so that we could take it forward. That's, again, a great ability, one that I respect very strongly. So that relates to what I said about epistemology, methods. In fact, I would say, and this is moving more towards my own approach, building on David's ideas very strongly, really there are three fundamental approaches, what I would call outer experimentation. I have a background in cognitive neuroscience and psychology, and of course subjecting people to investigations of one kind. I would call that outer experimentation. Inner experimentation, which comes to the fore in all of the spiritual traditions, not just the Eastern ones, but David looked at it especially in Eastern traditions. That is understanding introspectively in a very disciplined way, through obviously a lot of practice, understanding the nature of mental processes, insights into consciousness, inner experimentation. The third, I think, is one that is undervalued in the transpersonal movement. It is one that I hope to do some more writing to bring forward, and it actually relates to what I said before about religion standing slightly uneasily within the transpersonal psychology movement. The third is to do with revelation. To use a not non-religious term, I would relate this to intuition. But the fact is that all of the major insights that come through the traditions that David, myself and others are so interested in, well, I would say, I don't know about all, maybe I should say the majority, are presented in these texts in relation to commentarial traditions. The insights arise through the mystic, especially I'm interested in mysticism. The insights arise through the hermeneutic experiential engagement with the sacred text. So this is an area that I see as moving forward, and like I said earlier, we need to move the tradition forward. That's what David would want. And as I say, I think David was, because of his interest in traditional religion, Christianity in particular, he was very well aware of these great traditions based through a grasp of revelation. And then to move on to another criterion for classifying David as a transpersonal psychologist. And I think this is perhaps the last one I'll be mentioning. Recognition of a beyond. Now, there's a biggie. And I make no apologies for bringing it in our context today, because there is no question that David recognized the beyond. The question concerns what we mean by a beyond. You know, William James had a great get-out here. I'm sure many of you know his writings in the varieties of religious experience. He simply used the word more. Like I say, what? More of what? What is the more? He didn't need to explain. I mean, he did talk about how, this is William James, you know, we, in spiritual, mystical states, we encounter a higher part of ourselves, and the more is a kind of continuation of that higher part of ourselves. But the fact is that we don't have a word for it. It is more. I think there's more. I'm sure most in this room think there's more. I know absolutely without doubt that David thought there was more. And we could discuss whether that more is able to fit into a physicalist or naturalistic kind of worldview. It's become very popular to talk about naturalistic religion, for example. It's not quite my bag. I don't think it was quite David's bag. But there's a discussion to be had. But the point is, wherever we stand with that discussion, recognizing that there is some other dimension that we need to explore, that I think is seminal to transpersonal psychology, and David was a great guide for us in that area. And I want to actually, if we can, technical issues notwithstanding, I want to bring some of David's words into the room. Bernard mentioned that David's final engagement was with the Transpersonal Psychology section. I think the conference that we held last year, I think his death came within 4 or 5 weeks of that. And it was really quite an amazing thing that he gave his last keynote presentation at that conference. I think some of us thought that he was already, maybe he wasn't quite the self that he had been, but he wasn't a sick man in an extreme sense at all. And he gave a very illuminating lecture. The lecture was called Mysticism and Transpersonal Psychology. I do think it's poignant that this was his last presentation. With due respect to my colleagues of the SBR, I think David's heart lay in the area of mysticism. And as I said, the notion of beyond. And that was his last contribution. Mick, are we able to use it? Yeah.
Let's see.
Okay, so I don't know how well you hear that. Towards the end, he says, and I may not quote exactly right, but he says, he actually uses the phrase, and these are my last words. Obviously, I mean, I'm not getting over superstitious here. He was coming to the end of the lecture, and these were the last words he was giving in the lecture. But I think it's poignant. And these are my last words, and then he refers to the reality of the other world, beyond the veil, as he puts it. And he says, right at the end, it's not just somewhere else, it's here now. That's what he says. So I apologise, I think the quality wasn't too good. I think, that captures David. I mean, obviously we know that he wrote in the afterworld and his interest in that material and so on. I think it's very refreshing to be in the presence of someone who has that kind of conviction. You know, some of us can be a little mealy-mouthed, I think. And some of us are concerned about how we fit with our colleagues. And maybe we want to make sure that we don't rock the boat too much and all this kind of stuff. David was a real person, and you knew where he stood. And I respected that incredibly. And I do think that many in this room would echo that. The flyer. I hope you've all seen this. You're not going to see it. It's not big enough. But I hope you, because this was what brought you here, actually. It's a great picture. And actually credit to Jessica there, who found that the image that we're using on this flyer. Just in case you didn't notice it, or you can't see it here, it's by the seashore, and there are footprints in the sand. Absolutely perfect. David explored those footprints, and he also left us footprints between the worlds. He was a guide between the worlds. Very rare kind of person. And I want to finish another phrase of his that floated in and out as I was preparing to speak today. And I'm sure many would also hear this. When we would say goodbye, and I say, I'll see you again soon. What did he say? If we're spared. No? Didn't say that to you? If we're spared, Les. If we're spared. And, it's a quaint phrase, and there were many things about David which are quite quaint. But there's a lot more to it than that. It's something about living a life subject to the reality of something larger. When he said if we're spared, if you took it the wrong way, you might think, it's kind of fatalistic. Wow. It's okay. Fatalistic. A sort of dependent on God or whatever, and we might sort of want to dismiss that somewhat. No. It's part of a participatory vision. Those connected with transpersonal psychology, that's one of the words that are really kind of with it at the moment. We live in we participate with the ultimate mystery. My own tradition, Judaism and Kabbalah in particular, is an incredibly interactive, that the mystic is somehow not just receiving bounteous gifts, but the mystic is ultimately responsible for the development of the Godhead itself. Well, that's another topic, I'm not going into that now. This sense of participating in a larger, ultimate mystery, I think that is really something that feeds through into David's present. Of course, in the end, he wasn't spared. And it's a great loss to myself, and I'm sure to everyone in this room, and many beyond this room. Where he is, well, maybe we'll learn more about that in some of the other presentations. But I just want to remember a wonderful friend, a powerful presence in my life, a great human being, and someone who certainly was a transpersonal psychologist. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Les, for getting the day off to a wonderful start. I mean, and what was notable about your talk was not only the excellent way in which you reviewed David's sort of contribution to the subject of transpersonal psychology, but also the many references you made to his own personality. And I'm sure that's going to be very much a recurrent theme throughout the day. This is very much it's not just an academic meeting about David's contribution, it's really about David the person. So thank you for that. I was struck by your references at the beginning to the sort of tensions perhaps between transpersonal psychology and religion. And in a way there's similar tensions, I guess, between parapsychology and transpersonal psychology. So I've always felt in this field this sort of double bridge between psychical research and the transpersonal, and between transpersonal psychology and religion. And of course David was the person who walked on both those bridges and brought them together. And your talk brought that together very nicely, so thank you for that. And I have to be honest and say that not all psychical researchers are of a spiritual inclination, as I'm sure the SBR people know only too well. And there would be many people within psychical research who would think that David was too much of a mystical spiritual inclination. But that's, to me, all part of the fascination of the field. You know, people come from different perspectives. Just as one has this, the polarity between the experimenters and the spontaneous case investigators. So thank you very much for raising those issues. And also, I have to say, I was fascinated by your initial remark where you referred to David's, I think you put it, his antipathy towards PowerPoint and all things electronic, the kicking and screaming whenever PowerPoint raised.
It was an exaggeration.
Well, it was a pleasant one, because when I got Ingrid's email, she told me, when she gave the talk, she said her talk, which she presented, which I read out to you, had mysteriously disappeared from a machine, and she had to do it all over again. Last night, I was preparing at 1 a.m. some extra PowerPoint slides, and something which has never happened before, the whole PowerPoint presentation disappeared. And it's never happened before. Now, of course, I'm not the sort of person to read in to such natural phenomena, any mystical event. However, it is an interesting coincidence. I couldn't help being a little bit amused that maybe David was there. Why David would want to get rid of the PowerPoint slides, I don't know. But anyway. So can we show our appreciation to Les for